이제 이번 컨퍼런스에 우리 초청 강사이신 앨리스터 맥그래스 교수님을 잠시 소개하겠습니다. 사실 소개가 필요 없을 정도로 우리가 이미 잘 알고 또 한국 교회에 이미 많은 책들이 번역 출간되었습니다. It is our honor and privilege to introduce Professor 앨리스터 맥그래스 today. Actually, we don't need to introduce him since you already knew him very well, and most of his books are translated and published in Korea. 어떤 분은 사실 세계에서 가장 박식한 신학자가 누구냐라고 할 때 스위스의 신학자 한스 울 본 바르사라고 하는 사람이 있습니다. 제가 볼 때 지금 살아계신 분들 중에 아마 우리 맥그래스 교수님이 그 범주에 들어가지 않나 그렇게 생각합니다. Someone calls Hans Ur von Balthasar a Swiss theologian, one of the most erudite theologian in the 20th centuries. But to me, Professor McGrath is the kind who is living now. 어떤 면에서 또 우리 맥그래스 교수님을 소개할 때 제가 볼 때 가장 루이스적인 분이 아닌가 생각합니다. 앞으로 강의에서 설명하시겠지만 루이스와 매우 비슷한 그러한 그 과정과 백그라운드를 갖고 계시고 세계 신학계만 아니라 일반 성도님들에게도 귀한 영향력을 주고 계신 분입니다. 몇 년 전에 또 최고의 루이스 전기를 출간하시기도 하셨습니다. I think Professor McGrath is just like C.S. Lewis in every way. Dr. McGrath has a similar background with Lewis, and he has an authority in the academy and the public as well. Out of his love for C.S. Lewis, he wrote one of the best biographies of Lewis several years ago. 맥그래스 교수님께서는 이번에 저희 컨퍼런스와 또 자매 집회인 에드워즈 컨퍼런스 다음 주에 있는데 그걸 또한 섬길 것입니다. He will serve here in our Edwards conference, our sister conference next Monday as well. 지금은 옥스포드대학의 석좌교수로 지금 이제 풀 타이틀이 안드레아스 이드웨어스 Professor of Science and Religion, 그리고 이제 University of Oxford에서 지금 계시고 Director of Ian Ramsey Center for Science and Religion, 그리고 Fellow of Harris Manchester College에 지금 계시고 있습니다. He's now teaching in Oxford University in UK as an endowed professor, as I said earlier. And 사실 어저께 오셔서 굉장히 지금 피곤한 상태입니다. 그래서 여러분이 좀 집중해서 잘 들어주시면 감사하겠습니다. 맥그래스 교수님의 그 강의 제목은 이성 상상력과의 대화학입니다. 그래서 특별히 이제 우리 그 교회와 그 다음에 학계를 위한 우리 그 C.S. 루이스의 어떤 가치가 무엇인지에 대해서 말씀하실 것입니다. 그리고 번역본은 우리가 자막으로 동시에 이제 왼쪽에 띄울 것이고요. 또 여러분 그 풀 자막은 지금 링크 여러분 입구에 들어오실 때 받으셨죠? 그걸 하면 풀 링크가 지금 자막으로 여러분이 이제 다운로드 할 수 있을 것입니다. 그래서 여러분 참고해 주시고요. 그래서 the title of his lecture is full title is Engaging Reason and Imagination, Reflection on the Importance of C.S. Lewis for Theology and Ministry. 그러면 우리 맥그래스 교수님 모시고 루이스에 대해서 여러분 인생에서 최고의 강의를 들으시기를 바랍니다. I hope this lecture will be one of your best lectures in your life. Let's welcome him with a big round of applause.
Well, it's a very great pleasure to be here with you in Korea and to speak on C.S. Lewis and his relevance for theology and ministry. And Lewis and I have some things in common. We were both born in the city of Belfast, and we were both atheists who discovered Christianity at Oxford University. So I'd like to begin this lecture by explaining to you how I discovered C.S. Lewis and how I came to have such a great appreciation for his writings and his thought. As many of you will know, I was an atheist when I was a younger man, and I took the view that Christianity was outdated and irrelevant, and that it would soon disappear from the cultural landscape. One reason for my atheism was my interest in the natural sciences. It seemed clear to me that I had to be an atheist if I was going to be a good scientist. But another reason was that I could not see that Christianity possessed any intellectual or imaginative power. And after leaving high school, I went to Oxford University to study the natural sciences, especially chemistry, and began to realize that my earlier assumption that the sciences required atheism was very shallow and unsatisfactory. And I began to realize that science and faith could be held together in a constructive and deeply satisfying way. I also began to realize that I had failed to understand what Christianity was all about. I had considered it simply as a set of rules I needed to obey and a set of beliefs that I needed to accept. And I failed to appreciate that there was some living reality at its heart, which, when properly understood, changed the way I behaved and the way I thought. I also began to realize that atheism was actually a belief system, a faith. When I was an atheist, I could not prove that there was no God. My position was therefore one of believing that there was no God, but being unable to demonstrate conclusively that this was the case. And so, in one sense, my conversion to Christianity was about moving from one faith system, atheism, to another. As I began to reflect on Christianity, having grasped something of its richness and relevance, I began to realize I would need help in deepening my understanding of Christianity and making connections between my new faith and my love for the natural sciences. I was very fortunate to encounter many leading scientists at Oxford University who were Christians and who shared with me the ways in which they personally created links and connections between their faith and their scientific commitments. But I found it difficult to find Christians who had gone deep into their faith. For example, I was unable to find Christians who could help me to understand what the doctrine of the Trinity really meant, why it was important, and how to handle the apparent intellectual tensions that the idea of God as three in one seemed to create. Then, in February 1974, I discovered C.S. Lewis. Some of my friends who found it difficult to answer some of the questions I was asking about Christian doctrines like the Trinity suggested I should read Lewis, as they felt he had some good answers to the questions I wanted to explore. At that stage, I knew very little about C.S. Lewis. I knew he had written a children's book which had something to do with lions and wardrobes, but that was all I knew about him. However, encouraged by my friends, I began to read him. And I found in Lewis someone who wrote beautifully and clearly, who seemed to have anticipated many of the questions I was asking, and who offered me answers which I found satisfying and helpful. And so my love affair of C.S. Lewis began, and it continues to this day. As many of you will know, I marked the occasion of the 50th anniversary of Lewis's death in 2013 by publishing a new biography of this remarkable man. So it's a pleasure to be able to speak to you about why he is so interesting and significant in this lecture. So let me explain to you the structure of this lecture. I'll begin by considering Lewis's history, focusing especially on the reasons why he moved from atheism to Christianity. I'll then move on and consider some aspects of Lewis's thought, which are particularly significant for both academic theology and Christian ministry, including Lewis's view of Christianity as a big picture of reality, Lewis's use of stories and their importance for preaching, Lewis's apologetic method, including his argument from desire, and Lewis's analysis of how we can learn from and use the resources of the Christian past. So let me begin by telling you something about C.S. Lewis and how he moved from his early atheism to his mature Christianity. Clive Staples Lewis, to use his full name, was born in the Irish city of Belfast on 29th November 1898, entering into a changing political world increasingly shaped by the growing influence of Irish nationalism. And a close relationship developed between Clive and his elder brother, Warren. In 1905, the family moved to a large new house in Belfast. And Lewis's earliest memories of this house were of large quantities of books scattered throughout its bedrooms and corridors. Both his father and mother read widely, and Lewis found that he was free to roam and read as he pleased. When his older brother left home to go to school in England, Lewis found comfort in reading, developing a vivid sense of imagination and longing. Literature seemed to him to be a gateway to another world. Now, Lewis's mother died of cancer in August 1908, bringing the innocence and the security of his childhood to an end. And unwisely, Lewis's widowed father decided to send his younger son away from home to be educated at boarding schools in England. And as Lewis's autobiographical narrative in Surprised by Joy makes clear, he found life at these schools somewhat difficult. And in the end, realizing how unhappy his son had become, Albert Lewis decided his only option was to have his son taught privately. And Lewis was sent to study with William Kirkpatrick, a retired schoolteacher who had once been Albert Lewis's headmaster, who now lived in the southern English county of Surrey. And it was a good decision. Lewis flourished in this new environment, and Kirkpatrick introduced Lewis to the Oxford tutorial model, forcing him to develop and defend his views in sustained conversation. So Lewis's experience with Kirkpatrick was educationally formative. And thanks to Kirkpatrick's astute mentoring, Lewis won a scholarship to University College, Oxford, to study classics in December 1916. By this time, Lewis had become a trenchant, even a strident atheist. And Lewis's letters to his close friend Arthur Greaves during this period make it clear this was not an adolescent reaction against the faith of his parents, but an informed rejection of belief in God based on arguments that Lewis believed to be unanswerable. By now, the First World War was in its third year, and Lewis took the decision to volunteer to serve in the British Army. He went up to Oxford University in April 1917 to study classical Greek and Latin literature, while at the same time training for military service. In November 1917, Lewis was commissioned as a second lieutenant in an infantry regiment and deployed to northern France. his wartime experiences reinforced his atheism. Lewis had ambitions to be a poet, and his poetry of this period protests against a silent and indifferent heaven. Several months later, Lewis was wounded and sent home to England to recover. He was demobilized in December 1918 and resumed his academic studies at Oxford in January 1919, joining many other young soldiers who had survived the war and were now trying to return to living a normal life. Lewis proved to be an outstanding student. Kirkpatrick's mentoring ensured he could hold his own in tutorials and had given him a deep grasp of both Latin and Greek, allowing him to study the history, literature, and philosophy of the ancient world from the original texts. He was awarded first-class honors in classics, and realizing that he needed to widen his academic competency in order to secure a teaching position at Oxford, Lewis went on to gain first-class honors in English language and literature in 1923, compressing 2 years of studies into a single year. Lewis was appointed to a temporary lectureship in philosophy at University College, Oxford, for the academic year 1923 to 24, before being appointed to a tutorial fellowship in English language and literature at Magdalen College, Oxford, in 1925. And Lewis now became a member of the Oxford University Faculty of English Language and Literature, where he developed a growing friendship with J.R.R. Tolkien, encouraging Tolkien to complete and publish the romantic trilogy that we now know as The Lord of the Rings. Tolkien was looking for a sympathetic reader to help him develop his writing skills, and found Lewis to be his best and often his only literary advisor. Although Lewis was still an atheist when he took up his fellowship at Magdalen College, he was clearly experiencing doubts about the intellectual coherence and spiritual adequacy of this position. And there are signs that he was prepared to consent, though with considerable reluctance, to the possible existence of some abstract notion of God by about 1920. His conversion to theism involved realizing that God was an active agent, not simply an explanatory principle. During the 1920s, Lewis came to see atheism as intellectually uninteresting. It stifled the life of the imagination. The world of the logically provable was inadequate and unsatisfying. And Lewis became convinced there had to be more to life than this. And he found that two forces seemed to be at war within his soul: a plausible yet dull rationalism and a risky yet potentially exhilarating faith. And these words from his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, sum up the dilemma he faced at the time. On the one side, a many-islanded sea of poetry and myth. On the other, a glib and shallow rationalism. Nearly all that I loved, I believed to be imaginary. Nearly all that I believed to be real, I thought grim and meaningless. Now, these lines of thought provoked Lewis to reconsider the rationality of belief in God and eventually to embrace Christianity. Although Lewis's conversion is traditionally dated to the summer of 1929, it's my view that the evidence indicates that this change of belief dates from the following year, 1930. However, I do not think we need to know the precise date of his conversion to understand Lewis's significance. Following his discovery of God in 1929 or 1930, a further development took place, partly as a result of a 1931 conversation with J.R.R. Tolkien over the role of narratives in making sense of the world. And Lewis now moved from a generalized belief in God to embrace Christianity. And while the time scale of this second phase of Lewis's conversion remains frustratingly unclear at points, the process of intellectual realignment was essentially complete by the summer of 1932, when he returned to his home city of Belfast to write The Pilgrim's Regress, an allegorical account of his own journey to the Christian faith, along with some reflections on its implications. Now, Lewis's conversion to Christianity, which he later described in Surprised by Joy, initially had little impact on his academic career. His first academic book, The Allegory of Love, published in 1936, was well received, winning the Sir Israel Gollancz Memorial Prize in 1937. And the publication of this book marked the beginning of Lewis's rise to academic fame, which was sealed with his magisterial English literature in the 16th century, 1954, and his election as a Fellow of the British Academy. Yet, Lewis's academic reputation at Oxford was damaged during the 1940s by his decision to write popular works dealing with issues relating to Christian apologetics. Lewis's first work of popular apologetics, The Problem of Pain, 1940, probably did Lewis's reputation little harm and may actually have enhanced it. But the Screwtape Letters, 1942, irritated many of his colleagues. Yet many admired Lewis's more accessible writings and encouraged him to write more. And Lewis was not so much a popularizer as a translator of theology, an apologist who was able to give a good account of the rationality of the Christian faith and state its core themes in a language that was accessible outside academic circles. The British Broadcasting Corporation invited Lewis to give a series of talks during the Second World War in 1942, and these proved so successful they led to 3 further series. And Lewis eventually published these with some minor changes as Mere Christianity, 1952, now generally considered to be his most influential non-fiction work. Lewis achieved celebrity status in the United Kingdom during the Second World War and in the United States shortly afterwards. Now, this fame might have faded away if Lewis had not developed a quite unexpected line of writing, which took most of his family and friends by surprise. In October 1950, the first of the 7 Chronicles of Narnia appeared. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe became a children's classic, showing Lewis's remarkable facility to engage the imagination and use it as a gateway for theological exploration, most notably in relation to the notion of incarnation. Aslan, the great and noble Lion of Narnia, became one of the most firmly established literary characters of the 20th century. Yet by the time the final novel in this series, The Last Battle, was published in 1956, Lewis had moved from Oxford University to Cambridge. Lewis had been elected as the first holder of the University of Cambridge's newly established chair in medieval and Renaissance literature. And although Lewis now returned to his Oxford home at weekends, he spent weekdays during university term at Cambridge in his rooms at Magdalen College. After his move to Cambridge, Lewis wrote rarely in an explicitly apologetic mode, preferring to supplement his academic writings with more popular works exploring aspects of the Christian faith for the benefit of believers, such as Reflections of the Psalms, 1958, and The Four Loves, 1960. The death from Lewis's wife, Joy Davidman, from cancer in 1960 prompted Lewis to write under a pseudonym a short book entitled A Grief Observed, which is now often cited as one of the finest accounts of the grieving process. By June 1963, it was clear that Lewis himself was very unwell. Long-standing problems with his prostate gland had become more serious, with renal complications developing, which placed his heart under strain. So Lewis accepted the inevitable and resigned from his Cambridge chair and openly discussed his death with his correspondents. He died at his Oxford home in the early evening on the 22nd November 1963, the same day on which John Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. And Lewis is buried in the churchyard of Holy Trinity Church, Headington Quarry in Oxford, where he worshipped every Sunday. Now, following Lewis's death in 1963, his popularity and influence declined, partly reflecting the rapid changes in Western culture during the 1960s. Lewis himself had taken the view that his writings would fade into obscurity within 5 years of his death, and he had no expectations of remaining a long-term presence on either the literary or the religious scene. Yet, he was wrong. By 1980, Lewis had bounced back. Questions of meaning had become important again in Western culture. Religion, dismissed as an outmoded irrelevance in the 1960s, began to become an increasingly important force in private piety and public life in the United States. And Lewis enjoyed a resurgence. And for many, his renewed appeal lay in the imaginatively winsome Chronicles of Narnia, especially The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, now regularly cited as one of the best children's books of the 20th century. Others point to his more rational defense of Christianity in Mere Christianity, which reassured many about the intellectual credentials of their faith. Lewis's popularity reflects his remarkable ability to communicate orthodox theological ideas in culturally accessible forms, and his appeal to the imagination secured a new lease of life for religious ideas and values in a post-rationalist Western culture. Yet, whatever the explanations for Lewis's continuing popularity and influence may be, it's a simple fact that more than a generation after his death, Lewis's works are now more popular than at any point during his lifetime. And Lewis is popular for some very good reasons. He is an elegant and engaging writer who offers some helpful and stimulating reflections on Christianity. So let us turn to consider the 4 aspects of Lewis's thought that I believe remain helpful to Christian pastors and theologians today. The first major aspect of Lewis's thought I believe to be relevant to theology and ministry today is Lewis's view of Christianity as a big picture of reality. And we find this idea expressed at many points in his works, but perhaps most famously in the concluding sentence of a paper he read at the Socratic Club in Oxford in 1945. I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. And this beautifully crafted sentence acts as both the conclusion and the climax of Lewis's remarkable paper entitled Is Theology Poetry? Lewis's fundamental intention here was to affirm the conceptual capaciousness of the Christian faith, which is able to fit in science, art, morals, and others' religions. Now, some would argue that Christianity is fundamentally about salvation and the transformation of lives and individuals. This point needs to be taken very seriously, but it cannot be overlooked that part of this transformation is the emergence of a new way of thinking about the world, of seeing our universe and our place within it. We might think of Paul's great injunction to his readers to be actively transformed by the renewal of your minds, rather than being passively conformed to the world. That's Romans 12:2. Or his concept of the mind of Christ. And as an atheist turned Christian, Lewis was convinced of the apologetic need to set out the intellectual and imaginative appeal of Christianity to our wider culture. And for Lewis, this requires intelligent reflection on the content and practice of faith. Now, Lewis stands in a long tradition of Christian writers who have highlighted the capacity of Christianity to illuminate reality and help us understand what life is all about. For Lewis, an informed understanding of Christianity provides both clarification of what we ought to be doing and a motivation for doing this. As Lewis pointed out in his discussion of the Christian hope, what might be seen as, by some, as theological escapism actually turns out to be empowering. He wrote, "The Christians who did most for the present world were just those who thought most of the next." Now, Lewis here sets out a theme that became increasingly important to him during the 1920s. The need for a worldview that was capable of coping with the complexity of our world outside us and our experience within us. While still an atheist, Lewis noted that he found leading writers of the 1920s, such as George Bernard Shaw or H.G. Wells, to be a little thin and lacking depth. And he felt that what he called the roughness and density of life did not seem to be adequately reflected in their works. But the Christian poet George Herbert seemed to Lewis to excel in, I quote, conveying the very quality of life as we actually live it. Yet, as an atheist at this stage, Lewis was puzzled by the fact that George Herbert used Christianity as a lens through which to make sense of his world. Maybe, Lewis thought, Herbert had discovered something about Christianity that he himself had failed to see. And so Lewis became one of the most outspoken defenders of the rationality of the Christian faith during the 20th century. And Lewis's distinct approach was to argue that the viewpoint, which was derived from the Bible and the Christian tradition, was able to offer a more satisfactory explanation of common human experience than its rivals, including, of course, the atheism he had once himself espoused. His main criterion in making this evaluation was the ability of a way of thinking to take in our observations and experiencing. As we'll see later in this lecture, Lewis's apologetic approach generally takes the form of identifying a common human observation or experience and then showing how it fits in naturally and plausibly within a Christian way of looking at things. And Lewis held that Christianity provided this big picture of reality, an intellectually capacious and imaginatively satisfying way of seeing things that help to make sense of what we observe or experience. For example, Lewis argues that the common human experience of a sense of moral obligation is easily and naturally accommodated within a Christian framework. He also argues that the human sense of longing for something that is really significant, yet which proves frustratingly difficult to satisfy, is a clue to humanity's true fulfillment lying with God. Now, in my own case, I stopped being an atheist when I was a student at Oxford University, partly because of my growing realization of the intellectual overambition of the form of atheism I'd earlier accepted, but also as I came to realize that Christianity offered a better way of making sense of the world I observed around me and experienced within me. It provided a conceptual framework that brought my world into focus. It confronted the ambiguity of our world and human existence, and it offered a way of making sense of what often seemed like a senseless world. So mine was an intellectual conversion, lacking any emotional or affective dimensions. Yet it wasn't so much this or that individual aspect of Christianity which seemed of especial importance to me. It was its overall vision rather than its constituent parts that lay at the heart of its appeal. And as the American philosopher W.V.O. Quine suggested some years ago in his landmark essay, Two Dogmas of Empiricism, what really matters is the ability of a theory as a whole to make sense of the world. And G.K. Chesterton, a British apologist who made a deep impression on Lewis, made much the same point in his famous 1903 essay, The Return of the Angels. And in this essay, Chesterton pointed out that it wasn't any individual aspect of Christianity was persuasive, but the overall big picture of reality that it offered. And after a period of agnosticism, Chesterton found himself returning to Christianity because it offered an intelligible picture of the world. And again, for Chesterton, it was the Christian vision of reality as a whole, rather than any of its individual components, that proved to be compelling. Individual observations of nature didn't prove Christianity to be true. Rather, Christianity validates itself by its ability to make sense of those observations. And Chesterton wrote these words: "The phenomenon does not prove religion, but religion explains the phenomenon." And as we'll see in the third section of this lecture, Lewis takes up and develops this approach in his apologetic writings. So let me now turn to my second theme, the importance of stories. Human beings tell stories to make sense of our individual and corporate experience, whether this sense-making is framed in political or religious or more general terms, and to transmit these ideas in culture. Narratives provide a natural way of organizing, recalling, and interpreting experience, allowing the wisdom of the past to be passed on to the future, and helping communities gain a subjective sense of social or religious identity and historical location. But why do we tell stories in this way? Why are we storytelling and meaning-seeking animals? If storytelling is a fundamental human instinct, what story can be told to explain our propensity to tell stories? The Swiss psychoanalyst Carl Jung famously suggested that there were certain universal psychic structures which underlie human experience and behavior, an idea which was taken up in Joseph Campbell's famous account of the fundamental plot lines of stories, such as the myth of the hero. And Campbell developed the idea of a monomyth, the idea that all mythic narratives are basically variations on a single great story, so that a common pattern can be discerned between the narrative elements of most great myths. And this basic idea has proved deeply influential within the film industry and has created popular interest in seeing how successful movie plot lines often conform to Campbell's basic ideas. Yet, a Christian answer can be given to the question of why we tell stories, and it's grounded in the notion of humanity being created by God and bearing the image of God. For both Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, our natural inclination and capacity to create stories, such as the great fantasy epic of the Lord of the Rings, are the result of bearing the image of God. And Tolkien put it like this: fantasy remains a human right. We make in our measure and in our derivative mode because we are made. And not only made, but made in the image and likeness of a maker. And Tolkien argues that we create stories which are ultimately patterned on the grand story of God. And for Tolkien, one of the great strengths of the Christian narrative was its ability to explain why human beings tell stories of meaning in the first place. For Tolkien, the Christian gospel enfolded and proclaimed what he called a story of a larger kind, which embraced what he found to be good and true and beautiful in the great myths of literature, expressing this as what he called a far-off gleam or echo of evangelium, gospel, in the real world. And Lewis develops a similar account of the imaginative power and conceptual richness of stories in several of his essays, most notably the three papers Myth Became Fact, 1944, Is Theology Poetry, 1945, and On Stories, 1947. And the basic principles set out in these essays are put into practice in the Chronicles of Narnia, which we'll explore later in this lecture. And we find a similar approach in Dorothy L. Sayers. Sayers was an important member of Lewis's circle of scholarly friends, and in her 1941 work, The Mind of the Makers, Sayers sets out her own distinct view of the image of God in humanity as a kind of imaginative template which predisposes human beings to think and to imagine in certain ways. And what she calls the same pattern of the creative mind is evident in both theology and art. And Sayers held that the pattern of human creative processes correspond to the actual structure of the living universe, so that the pattern of the creative mind is an eternal idea that is rooted in the being of God. So, stories thus express something profound about who we are, which in turn expresses something about the God who created us in this manner. So, let's turn to Lewis and see how he uses stories in his writings. In a perceptive and sympathetic account of Lewis's use of stories, entitled Theology and Stories, the American theologian Gilbert Meilander focuses on what he believes to be Lewis's most important achievement, showing how stories help us to step inside another way of seeing our world, the Christian way of seeing ourselves and this world. Manolo suggests this is an aspect of Lewis's thought which is seen at its best in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, as Lewis relates how Lucy Pevensey discovered a book that seemed to bring her close to, if not directly in contact with, something of ultimate significance that lay beyond time. And here's what Malander has to say about this. Lewis tells stories which expand the imagination and give one a world within which to live for a time. Like Lucy, the reader can almost forget he's reading a story at all and be living in the story as if it were real. Lewis offers not abstract propositions for belief, but the quality, the feel of living in the world narrated by the biblical story. So, how does Lewis use narratives to help us do theology? How can we use stories to communicate theology in our sermons? Let me give you an example to help you see how helpful Lewis can be here. We all know that the figure of Jesus Christ stands at the heart of the Christian faith, someone who's to be known and adored rather than merely being the object of theological analysis and dissection. And the central Christian idea of the incarnation declares that, the words of John 1:14, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And this act of divine incarnation discloses God's compassion and care for both the world and humanity, making possible a transformation of the human situation, which Christian theology describes using the language of salvation or atonement, which allows those who embrace this new way of existence to live in hope. And while the incarnation helps us to grasp the significance of Jesus Christ for humanity, it also tells us something about the kind of God that Christians love and worship. During my own atheist phase, I thought of God as a distant reality standing behind or outside history, detached from human existential concerns and shielded from the traumas of history. And I could see no intellectual or existential case for believing in a God like that. But the biblical affirmation that the Word became fleshed and lived among us offers a radically different concept of God, not the abstract and remote God of the philosophers, but a God who cares for us, not as a passive, distant observer, but as an active fellow traveler and a constant companion within the historical process. God is someone we can know and address in worship and prayer. If we lose sight of this personal concept of God, Christianity becomes a philosophy of religion rather than a faith. And the British philosopher Roger Scruton expressed this point rather nicely with these words: "The God of the philosophers disappeared behind the world because he was described in the third person and not addressed in the second." Now, perhaps the best example of Lewis using a narrative to explain the significance of the incarnation imaginatively is to be found in a sermon he preached in London during the Second World War. And Lewis attempts to explain the meaning of the incarnation by telling the story of a diver who was determined to rescue something precious that has fallen into the mud at the bottom of a deep lake. And this diver plunged into the cold, dark water, going deeper and deeper until his lungs close to bursting, he finally took hold of the object of his quest and rose again to the surface. And for Lewis, This is the story of God entering into the world in order to take hold of us and redeem us. God, Lewis wrote, descended into his own universe and rose again, bringing human nature up with him. Now, this is a helpful narrative which is open to further development, for example, in highlighting the costliness and commitment of redemption. But its chief function is to give imaginative substance to a central Christian theme that can too easily become an intellectual abstraction. The incarnation is not a static and timeless idea, but the Christian way of interpreting something that happened, the life, death, and resurrection of Christ, and its implications for us. And Lewis also helps us to reflect on how to communicate Christian ideas that too easily seem to be abstract and difficult to conceive, such as sin. Sin is too easily perceived as an abstract idea that lacks substance and imaginative appeal. And there is an important point being made here. We need a way of grasping the reality and significance of sin through becoming imaginatively receptive towards it. And one of the best ways we can do this is through narratives which engage our imagination in order to help us reflect on their intellectual substance. So, what narrative could be told to help convey the idea of sin as a force that entraps us and from whose power we cannot escape? How can we become imaginatively receptive to this kind of idea? In The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, Lewis tells the story of a rather unpleasant schoolboy called Eustace Clarence Scrubb. And Lewis portrays Scrubb as a greedy and self-centered person whose objectives are dominated by the idea of becoming rich. And Scrubb sees himself in terms of a narrative in which the possession of riches leads to him becoming a master of his destiny and world. And yet too late, he discovers that he has instead been mastered by his desires, which he finds he cannot control. He has been taken captive by his obsessions. Lewis explored the corruption of Eustace Scrubb using a literary analogy, the Old Norse legend of the greedy giant Fafnir, who turned himself into a dragon to protect his accumulated treasure. And on finding a hoard of riches in a dragon's lair, Eustace becomes intoxicated by thoughts of his sudden acquisition of both power and wealth. And in a dramatic and beautifully described moment, Lewis tells of how Eustace changes into a dragon as a result of his greedy, dragonish thoughts. Eustace has become trapped within his imagined and self-serving story. And as disillusionment sets in, he realizes he cannot break free from it. He hoped he would merely turn out to be wearing a dragon costume, but he soon discovers he has actually become a dragon. He cannot remove the dragon's skin, and every attempt to do so merely reveals another layer of scales beneath it. I think it's difficult for us not to feel sympathy with Eustace, who finds himself in this hopeless and helpless situation. However, the story then takes a dramatic, even unexpected turn. A lion appears and tears away at the dragon flesh with his claws. Now, Eustace does not know the lion's name, but the reader knows it is Aslan. And the lion's claws cut so deeply that Eustace is in real pain. And when the dragon scales are finally removed, this mysterious lion plunges the raw and bleeding Eustace into a well from which he emerges purified and renewed with his humanity restored. And this immersion in the water of the well picks up on the New Testament's language about baptism as our dying to self and rising to Christ in Romans 6. In effect, breaking free from a narrative of oppression and captivity and becoming part of a narrative of liberation. So what can we learn from this vivid story? Well, as the raw imagery of Aslan tearing at Eustace's flesh makes clear, Eustace has become trapped by forces over which he has no control. The one who would master has instead been mastered. The dragon is a symbol not so much of sin itself, but of the power of sin to entrap, to captivate, and to imprison. And the power of sin is such that it can only be broken and mastered by the Redeemer, by Aslan, the one who heals and renews Eustace, thus restoring him to what he was intended to be. Eustace, having become trapped in a web of falsehood and self-deceit, realized he becomes so deeply enmeshed, entangled within the story that he could not break free from its tissue of deception. Only Aslan can break the power of the story and enable Eustace to enter another story within which he really belongs. Now, Lewis's narrative here serves a double function. First, it represents a narrative transposal of the Christian themes of salvation and sin, vividly and realistically depicting sin as an enslaving force which cannot be overcome by human agency. God's grace alone is able to break the power of sin and liberate us from its spell. But secondly, it invites Christian apologists to reflect on what stories you might tell to make those same points in an imaginatively engaging and compelling way. The point is that we too easily become entrapped within stories which affect the way in which we see our world and blind us to seeing better ways. That was my experience as an atheist many years ago. I was blinded to the truth by narratives that depicted belief in God as intellectually ridiculous. Some of you will know the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein's comment that a picture held us captive. And this highlights how easily our understanding of the world can be controlled by a worldview or a meta-narrative that has, whether we realize it or not, come to dominate our perception of the world. And this picture causes us to interpret experience in certain ways as natural or self-evidently correct, while blinding us to other ways of understanding it. And Lewis helps us to see that we need to help people to realize that a materialist or atheist narrative is only one option. There are better options, and of course, the best of them all is Christianity. So let me now turn to my third theme, Lewis's approach to apologetics. For me, apologetics is best thought of as a principled attempt to defend and commend the Christian faith, both meeting objections that might be raised against it and attempting to explore and explain its potential attraction to those who have yet to discover it. And examples of such writing are found throughout Christian history, including such masterpieces as Justin Martyr's defense of Christianity against its Platonist critics in the 2nd century, Thomas Aquinas' demonstration of the rationality of the Christian faith in the 13th century, and Blaise Pascal's defense of the reasonableness of belief in God in the 17th century. And Lewis's public apologetic ministry began in 1940. With the publication of his first explicitly apologetic book, The Problem of Pain. And the later publication of Mere Christianity in 1952 solidified still further his reputation as one of the finest apologists of his age. Now, what is really interesting about Lewis's approach is that although it's thoroughly rational, it also often appeals to human experience as the starting point for an intellectual journey that leads to God. We see this approach especially in Mere Christianity itself. For Lewis, our experiences and intuitions, for example, about morality or desire, are clues that are meant to arouse our suspicions that there is indeed someone, something, which is directing the universe. And we come to realize, according to Lewis, that our moral experience suggests a real law which we did not invent and which we know we ought to obey. In much the same way as our experience of desire is, for Lewis, a kind of copy or echo of mirage of another place, which is our true homeland. And as we begin to explore this suspicion, we begin to realize it has considerable imaginative and explanatory potential. So, Lewis invites his readers to step into the Christian way of seeing things and to explore how things look when they're seen from this standpoint. Try seeing things this way. If worldviews or meta-narratives can be compared to lenses, then which of them brings things into sharpest focus? Clues taken by themselves prove nothing. Their importance lies rather in their cumulative and contextual force. In other words, the greater the number of clues that can be satisfactorily accommodated by a given view of reality, the more reliable that view of reality is likely to be. So let's look at Lewis's famous argument from desire, exploring both its rational structure but also its apologetic appeal. And the starting point for Lewis's approach is an experience, a longing for something that is undefined and possibly undefinable, that is insatiable as it is elusive. And Lewis sets out versions of this argument at several points in his writings, including the Chronicles of Narnia. In Surprise for Joy, for example, Lewis describes his childhood experiences of intense longing, which he names joy, for something unknown and elusive, which is triggered off by such things as the fragrance of a flowering bush in the garden of his childhood home in Belfast. But what did this mean, if it meant anything at all? What way of seeing it might help him to make sense of it? How was he to interpret it? While an atheist, Lewis dismissed such experiences as illusory. Yet he became increasingly dissatisfied with such simplistic, reductive explanations. And his growing familiarity with Christianity led him to appreciate that these experiences could easily and naturally be accommodated within its explanatory framework. What if God were an active, questing personal agent, as Christianity affirmed to be the case? If so, then God could easily be understood, as Lewis put it, as the source from which those arrows of joy had been shot at me ever since childhood. In Mere Christianity, Lewis uses this approach to engage the human experience of longing and dissatisfaction, a sense of hovering on the brink of discovering something of immense significance, linked with a sense of sorrow and frustration that when what seemed to be so close tantalizingly disappears beyond our reach. Like smoke, it just cannot be grasped. And as Lewis put it, there was something we grasped at in that first moment of longing, which just fades away in the reality. So what does a sense of unfulfilled longing mean? What does it point to? Lewis concedes that some might suggest this frustration arises simply from looking for its true object in the wrong places. Others might say, well, since further searching will only result in repeated disappointment, there's no point in trying to find something better than the present world. But Lewis argues there's a third approach, which recognizes that these earthly longings are only a kind of copy or echo or mirage of our true homeland. And since this overwhelming desire cannot be fulfilled through anything in this present world, it follows that it's fulfilled somewhere else. Lewis writes, if I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the probable explanation is that I was made for another world. And there are many examples of this experience I could mention to help you understand the appeal of Lewis's approach. Let me give you one example. Bertrand Russell, one of the most articulate and influential British atheist writers of the 20th century, put a similar thought into words as follows. The center of me is always a searching for something beyond what the world contains, something transfigured and infinite, the beatific vision. God, I don't find it. I don't think it is to be found, but the love of it is my life. It's the actual spring of life within me. And Russell's daughter, Catherine Tate, took the view her father's life was really an unacknowledged, perhaps disguised search for God. And her reflections on Russell's experience are very helpful to us as we reflect on Lewis's approach to apologetics. Here's what she wrote. Somewhere at the back of my father's mind, at the bottom of his heart, in the depths of his soul, there was an empty space that had once been filled by God, and he never found anything else to put in it. Russell was now haunted by a ghost-like feeling of not belonging in this world. Now here, as throughout his apologetic writings, the starting point for Lewis's approach does not lie with the Bible or the Christian tradition, but rather with shared human experiences and observations. How do we make sense of these? Lewis's genius as an apologist lay in his ability to show how a viewpoint based on the Bible and the Christian tradition was able to offer a more satisfactory explanation of common human experience than its rivals, especially the atheism he himself had once espoused. And so Lewis's apologetic approach is to identify a common human experience or observation and then show how it fits in naturally and plausibly within the Christian way of looking at things. For Lewis, Christianity provides this big picture, an intellectually capacious and imaginatively satisfying way of seeing things. Christianity is like a lens that brings things into sharp focus. And for Lewis, the truth of Christianity is expressed in its capacity to make sense of what we observe and experience. But let me now make a connection with my topic in the previous section, the use of stories. How does Lewis use stories in his apologetic approach? So let me focus here on an objection to Christianity famously raised by Sigmund Freud. Freud's Future of an Illusion, published in 1927, develops a strongly reductionist approach to religion, arguing that religious ideas are illusions, fulfillments of the oldest, strongest, and most urgent wishes of mankind. And for Freud, belief in God is a mere wish fulfillment, an expression and outcome of human longings, which represents an illusion that shields us from the harsh and unbearable realities of an incoherent world. Freud thus locates the human motivation for inventing a transcendent God in a human inability to cope with life without some transcendent basis. So how might we respond to these objections? Well, we could, for example, point out that if Freud's account of the psychogenesis of religious belief is right, then his own atheism has to be seen as the outcome of his own personal history, especially his troubled relationship with his father. Lewis, however, uses a very different approach. He tells a story. And we see his approach at its best in The Silver Chair, which is one of the latest novels in the Chronicles of Narnia. And Lewis here makes use of an imaginative gambit originally deployed by the Greek philosopher Plato, a dark underground cave illuminated only by the flickering flames of a fire. And the inhabitants of that cave who have lived there since birth have no notion that there is a greater world beyond this realm of shadows. Then some visitors from Narnia find themselves in an underland, ruled by a queen who tries to persuade them that Narnia is simply a figment of their imaginations. And one of the Narnians, Puddleglum, tries to explain that there really is an overworld beyond the dark realms of the underland, which is illuminated by something that's called the sun. And the queen ridicules this idea. Puddleglum has simply invented the idea of the sun. He's based it on the lamps he saw around him in the underland. You have put, she wrote, nothing into your make-believe without copying it from the real world, this world of mine, which is the only world. In any case, the queen argued that the idea of a sun was incoherent because Puddleglum talked about the sun hanging in the sky and lighting up the overworld. Well, just what did the sun hang from? Now, the reader of this passage encounters what seems to be a very sophisticated argument, which would clearly convince any inhabitant of the underland. Like the prisoners in Plato's cave, they knew no other world, and would thus probably dismiss Puddleglum's ideas about the sun as delusional and incoherent. Yet we read this passage from our own perspective. We know there is indeed an overworld illuminated by the sun, and the reader can switch perspectives, seeing how an argument that works well from one perspective is shown to be flawed from another. And Lewis's narrative allows his readers to flip their perspectives, their points of view, thus changing their informing perspectives. It allows another way of seeing things, challenging the narrative of materialist or naturalist worldview. Unless we see things in this new way, we'll remain trapped in our underground cave, being predisposed to believe not merely there's nothing beyond it, but that there cannot be anything beyond it. So Lewis thus creates imaginative space for his readers to place their beliefs about God and show that there are plausible alternatives to this kind of naturalism. Now, for Lewis, Christianity needs to be able to show it can tell a better story about human beings in our world than atheism can. And in his 1941 sermon, The Weight of Glory, Lewis considers how the cultural dominance of materialist worldview might be challenged. Like any materialist ideology, this tries to make the idea there is no transcendent dimension to life seem to be normal. All ideologies aim to achieve invisibility, so their ideas and values are simply assumed to be true. So how can their spell be broken? Lewis's answer remains significant. To break a spell, you have to weave a better spell. Let's listen to what Lewis has to say here. Spells are used for breaking enchantments as well as for inducing them. And you and I have need of the strongest spell that can be found to wake us from the evil enchantment of worldliness that's been laid upon us for nearly 100 years. And to break the spell of one narrative, a better narrative needs to be told, capable of capturing the imagination and opening the mind to alternative possibilities. Now, earlier in this lecture, I mentioned Wittgenstein's idea of being held captive by a picture. In other words, being locked into a single way of seeing the world. And Lewis's point is that we need to show that there are other ways of seeing the world, and that the Christian way of seeing the world offers a greater clarity of vision and a truthful and trustworthy account of the world and ourselves. And that's why the Chronicles of Narnia are so important apologetically. They retell the Christian story and show how it connects with the realities of our world and human experience. And Lewis's remarkable achievement in the Chronicles of Narnia is to allow his readers to inhabit this Christian narrative, to get inside the story and feel what it's like to be part of it. Mere Christianity allows us to understand Christian ideas, but the Narnia stories allow us to step inside the Christian story and experience it. And Lewis's point is that we can judge it by its ability to make sense of things and to chime in with our deepest intuitions of our truth, beauty, and goodness. And if a series is read in the order of publication, then the reader enters this narrative in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which concerns the coming of the Redeemer. The Magician's Nephew tells of the narrative of creation and fall, while The Last Battle concerns the ending of the old order and the advent of a new creation. And the remaining 4 novels, Prince Caspian, Voyage of the Dawn Treader, The Horse and His Boy, The Silver Chair, deal with the period between these 2 advents. And Lewis here explores the life of faith, lived in the tension between the past and the future comings of Aslan, in which Aslan is now at one and the same time an object of memory and hope. And Lewis speaks here of an exquisite longing for Aslan when he cannot be seen clearly, of a robust yet gracious faith which is able to withstand cynicism and skepticism, and of people of character who are walked trustingly through the shadowlands, seeing them in a mirror darkly and learning to deal with a world in which they're assaulted by evil and doubt. And by retelling the Christian story, Lewis enables Christians to grasp the significance of some of the core themes of their faith. But he also enables the church to grasp something of the deep appeal of the gospel and its profound capacity to change our lives. Finally, let us consider Lewis's view that we need to learn from the rich theological legacy of the past. Today's Christians, Lewis came to appreciate, need to learn from those who've made the journey of faith before us. Perhaps his best discussion of this issue is found in his introductory preface to an English translation of one of the most influential works of Christian theology dating back to the 4th century, Athanasius of Alexandria's treatise on the Incarnation. For Lewis, this represents a classic discussion of this theme, which transcends the barriers of culture and history. It's become a central reference point for contemporary discussion precisely because it sets out the issue so well and incisively. Now, Lewis began to read Christian classics as a result of his interest in English literature, and he soon realized that books become classics for a reason, namely that people continue to find in them something of value and excellence to which they return again and again. And Lewis argues that a familiarity with the literature of the past provides readers with a standpoint which gives them critical distance from their own era and thus allows them to see, as Lewis puts it, the controversies of the moment in their proper perspective. The reading of old books thus enables us to avoid becoming passive captives of the spirit of the age by keeping, as Lewis puts it, the clean sea breeze of the centuries blowing through our minds. And Lewis here clearly has theological debates in mind. And he's writing in particular about the importance of past theological resources to enrich and stimulate the present. Yet his argument has, I think, a broader significance. He writes, "A new book is still on its trial, and the amateur is not in a position to judge it. Since we cannot read the literature of the future, we can at least read the literature of the past and realize the powerful implicit challenge this makes to the ultimate authority of the present. For sooner or later, the present will become the past, and the self-evident authority of its ideas will be eroded unless that authority is grounded in the intrinsic excellence of those ideas rather than their mere chronological location." As Lewis pointed out, with the rise of ideologies in the 20th century in mind, someone who has lived in many places is not likely to be taken in by the local errors of his native village. The scholar, Lewis declares, has lived in many times and can thus challenge the automatic presumption of finality of present judgments and trends. Let's listen to Lewis as he sets out this position. We need intimate knowledge of the past. Not that the past has any magic about it, but because we cannot study the future, and yet we need to set something against the present to remind us that the basic assumptions have been quite different in different periods, and that much which seems certain to the uneducated is merely temporary fashion. So the greatest challenge a book faces is perhaps not how it's judged today, but how it will be judged a generation from now. Will it be valued? Will it be remembered at all? Christian classics like Athanasius' Treatise on the Incarnation or Augustine's Confessions provide the ability to tether us to our collective past, offering us resources that both inform us about our faith while revealing the blind spots of our own chronological parochialism. They anchor us to a continuous tradition of reflection, allowing us to see the great questions and problems of our own time and culture through the eyes of others. And as Lewis observed in his own introduction to Athanasius on the Incarnation, one of the chief values of old literature lies in its ability to challenge some of the assumptions that we take as self-evidently correct, but which are actually culturally situated and will one day seem strange to future generations. So, the rich theological heritage of our past can help us enrich our vision of the Christian truth by allowing us to see the gospel with new eyes, refreshing our vision and challenging our historical and cultural limitations. And Lewis spoke of the capacity of literature to open our eyes to our richer vision of reality in a way that, I quote, heals the wound without undermining the privilege of individuality. So let me read a brief passage from his latest work, An Experiment in Criticism, which makes this point well. My own eyes are not enough for me. I will see through those of others. In reading great literature, I become 1,000 men and yet remain myself. Like the night sky in the Greek poem, I see with a myriad eyes, but it's still I who see. And so engaging with the wisdom of the past, Lewis suggests, enable us to see with other eyes, to imagine with other imaginations, and to feel with other hearts as well as our own. So that's why we read Augustine, Luther, Calvin, to enrich us. And it's why we read Lewis as well. He's become part of this great legacy of the past. So, let me summarize what I've been saying in this lecture. As we've seen, Lewis affirms the rationality of our universe, but he does so without using cold logic and dreary argumentation. Lewis affirms the power of images and narratives to captivate our imagination, but he does this without giving up on the primacy of truth. And as the churches face an increasingly complex cultural context in which they must preach and minister, Lewis offers insights and approaches that are potentially enriching and, I believe, culturally plausible and intellectually persuasive. We need to engage both the reason and the imagination to help our culture grasp what is so significant about the gospel and how it could transform lives. In the end, Lewis tells the truth by showing the truth. He offers us an intellectually capacious and imaginatively compelling vision of the Christian faith, perhaps best summed up in that rich and engaging statement right at the end of his Oxford lecture, "Is theology poetry?" And using the powerful visual image I mentioned earlier in this lecture, Lewis invites us to see God as both the ground of the rationality of the world and the one who enables us to grasp that rationality. He wrote, "I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else." And that elegant and rich statement is both a fitting memorial to Lewis himself and to his rich understanding of faith. And how appropriate that that quote now adorns the memorial to Lewis that was placed in Westminster Abbey in London in 2013 to mark the 50th anniversary of his death. I hope I'll have persuaded you Lewis is someone who is worth reading and who opens up important possibilities for us as we reflect on how best to understand and communicate our faith to our culture. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for listening.
예, 우리 맥그래스 교수님 귀한 강의 감사합니다. 이어서 약 30분 정도 우리가 교수님께 우리 강의를 중심으로 해서 몇 가지 한번 질문 드리고 교수님께서 그거에 대해서 이제 말씀해 주시겠습니다. 우리가 이제 먼저 제가 영어로 질문을 하고요. 그 다음에 교수님께서 그 다음에 제가 한국어로 그걸 통역해서 말씀하고 그 다음에 교수님께서 말씀하시면 제가 그거를 정리해서 여러분에게 다시 한국말로 하는 걸로 하겠습니다. So I will ask you a question in English, and I will translate also the Korean as well, and then you will talk about the question and answer, and then I will translate to audience as well. Okay. So let me first ask you a question about friendship with C.S. Lewis. He talks about the close friendship between Lewis and Tolkien in terms of mutual role as a sort of midwife in the literary and spiritual aspect. In this regard, I think the Inklings is so crucial, especially for Lewis to become a Christian. Could you elaborate on this in light of the importance of his friendship, especially through his the Inklings? 제가 한국말로 일단 말씀드릴게요. 루이스의 우정에 대한 질문인데요. 교수님 강연에서 루이스와 톨킨의 상호 일종의 산파 역할을 했다라고 이제 문학적이면서 영적인 면을 가졌다고 이제 지적하셨습니다. 이런 점에서 특별히 잉클링스의 역할이 매우 중요하다고, 특별히 이제 루이스의 회심에서 중요한데 이 점에 대해서 조금 더 그 잉클링스와 그 어떤 친구와의 관계에 대해서 좀 설명을 부탁드립니다. 라고 질문입니다.
I think the Inklings was very important for both Lewis and Tolkien. Sure. For me, the important thing here is that both Lewis and Tolkien needed each other to develop their own visions of how to write novels. And the point is that they were there both as friends and critics for each other. They each took each other's visions of what they wanted to do very seriously, but they also criticized it. You can do better than this. Have you tried doing it this way? What about this? I think all of us need that kind of critical friend, someone who takes us very seriously, but is also prepared to say, well, have you thought of doing it this way? Is there not a better way of doing it? So I would say that the Inklings and the success of Lewis and Tolkien makes a very important Christian point, which is that each of us can help each other develop our visions of what we want to do and help us to do it better. So it seems to me there's a very important point to be made there.
잉클링스의 중요성은 특별히 이제 루이스와 톨킨에서 매우 중요하다고 그렇게 말씀하셨고요. 특별히 이제 두 만남을 통해서 특별히 이제 두 사람이 다 작가잖아요. 소설 작가일 때 서로에 대해서 때로는 친구로서 이제 말해주기도 하고, 때로는 굉장히 크리티컬하게 비판적이기도 하고, 그렇게 해서 어떻게 보면 이제 크리티컬 프렌드, 비판적인 어떤 친구로서 굉장히 서로 때로는 제안도 하고, 이렇게 쓰는 게 좋지 않니, 저렇게 쓰는 게 좋지 않니 해서 구체적인 어떤 그 제안도 하고, 그래서 말씀하시진 않았지만 실질적으로 둘이서 굉장한 그런 관계를 가졌던 걸 우리는 압니다. 그리고 잉클링스의 중요성은 특별히 우리 크리스천 관점에서 중요하다고 얘기하는 것이, 왜냐하면 어떻게 보면 서로 도울 수 있는 어떤 관계를 유지할 수 있는 어떤 그런 프렌드십을 유지할 수 있는 그런 관계라고 얘기합니다. 그래서 특별히 이제 서로 비전을 쉐어할 수 있고, 또 우리 신앙에 대해서 서로 도울 수 있는 그러한 면에서 잉클링스 영향이 톨킨과 루이스에게는 중요했다라고 얘기했습니다. 이제 물론 말씀 안 하시지만 결국은 이제 톨킨의 어떤 회심의 문제도, 아니 루이스의 회심의 문제도 굉장히 큰 영향을 주었다라고 얘기할 수 있습니다. 두 번째 우리 질문 제 말씀드리겠습니다. Second question is about Louis' view on Christianity as a big picture or lenses. According to your lecture, you emphasize on this. Transformation is the emergence of a new way of thinking. In this regard, Louis has a sort of a double vision of looking at and looking alone. As in the quotation, I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen and so on. And with this idea of big picture, he shows a sort of model as a defender of Christianity in terms of rationality and its conceptual capaciousness to fit in other fields. It's apologetic with common human experiences, and biblical worldview provides a good insight to our Christian community to evangelize. So the question is, and comment is like this: though we Korean pastors and Christians believe in and are confident in Christianity, but still we are not well equipped to talk and defend Christianity to others like Louis. So could you give us some hints to start our conversation with sort of non-believers?
Well, thank you. That's a very good question.
질문, the Korean one is okay.
Sorry. Go ahead.
루이스의 통찰 중 하나는 지적하신 대로 기독교를 현실의 큰 그림이자 렌즈로 보는 것입니다. 회심을 통해서 새로운 생각의 관점이 생기는 것인데, 이런 점에서 앞에서 인용하신 그 태양의 떠오름을 통한 그 이중 비전을 루이스는 제시합니다. 하나는 뭐냐면 통해서 보는 것과 또는 하나의 함께 보는 것입니다. 이런 큰 그림의 개념은 루이스가 기독교의 변호자의 어떤 모델을 잘 보여주고 있는데, 기독교의 합리성, 동시에 다른 영역에서 일종의 잘 맞춰지는 그런 지적인 방담의 관점입니다. 그의 변증적인 관점, 특별히 인간 공통의 경험과 성경적인 세계관을 통한 방법은 우리가 전도하는 데 좋은 통찰을 제공합니다. 질문이자 문제는 우리가 과연 우리 성도들과 한국 성도들과 목회자들이 기독교를 믿고 확신을 하는데 여전히 불신자들과 말하고 기독교를 또 변호하는 데 있어서는 잘 준비되지 않는 것 같습니다. 교수님께서 이런 저희들을 위해서 불신자들과 대화할 수 있는 구체적인 어떤 힌트를 우리에게 주시지 않겠습니까?
Well, that's still a very good question. I think there are different ways of doing apologetics. I mean, you'll find that some apologists who are very good at giving us rational arguments for believing in God, or indeed very good rational defenses of individual Christian doctrines. Lewis isn't really like that. I mean, there are points in Mere Christianity when he does give us some very good lines of approach to defending Christianity. But Lewis's main approach is rather different. What Lewis is saying is that in many ways I'm not setting out to prove the existence of God. What I'm saying is I know Christianity, I understand it. And what I want to do is to help you see how Christianity gives you a way of looking at the world which makes more sense than its alternatives and is deeply satisfying. And that's why that image of a lens really is helpful. Because Lewis is saying, judge a worldview by how well it focuses, how well it brings things into focus. And do you remember in the lecture I talked about Lewis's experience of reading the poet George Herbert? He was an atheist when he read George Herbert, but he felt there is something about the quality of the way in which Herbert is able to explain the world I don't see elsewhere, and it's got something to do with Herbert's Christianity. So I think Lewis is inviting us to think like this. He's inviting us to say, look, maybe when somebody says to me, well, as a Christian, how do you make sense of this? What you might try and do is to invite them to step inside a Christian way of looking at things and ask them, how does the world look from within that way of thinking? What is your existing way of looking at the world? Here's a different way of looking at it. May I invite you to compare these two different worlds? Which seems better? Which seems more truthful? Or again, I mentioned Wittgenstein's "We are held captive by a picture." Wittgenstein in many ways is saying we need to be at an art gallery and trying out different pictures and see which works best. So, your answer to somebody's question might not be a rational proof for God's existence. It might be, let me tell you how my faith makes sense of the dilemmas I face, the success of science, the reality of sin, and how it gives me hope to live in these situations. So Lewis is giving an approach which is one amongst several. What I want to say is that all approaches to apologetics are useful, but Lewis's, I think, resonates particularly well for a younger generation who are interested in stories and the use of the imagination. Not displacing other approaches, rather joining them, enriching them, being part of this bigger picture.
순서를 제가 어디 갔는지 찾고 있습니다. Okay, I lost the logic of your the answer, but I try to find. 맨 처음에 이제 변증을 얘기할 때, 특별히 이제 우리가 그 질문이 어떻게 하면 넌 크리스천들에게 기독교를 소개하고 변증할 것인가에 대한 그런 내용이잖아요. 근데 그럴 때 이제 변증은 여러 가지 다양하다고 얘기할 수 있는 거죠. 그래서 특별히 이제 루이스의 관심은 사실 직접적으로 이제 우리가 이제 보통 변증할 때 얘기할 때 하나님의 존재가 무엇이냐, 보통 그것이 이제 시작이거든요. 예를 들면 우리가 잘 아는 어콰이너스 이런 사람들이 보통 그렇게 시작하는데, 루이스는 그러고보다는 오히려 우리가 어떻게 기독교를 볼 것인가, 하나님을 어떻게 볼 것인가에 대해서 그런 관점을 돕는 역할을 한다라고 하는 거죠. 직접적으로 하기보다는 그런 식으로 세계를 볼 수 있고 또 관점을 볼 수 있게 그렇게 인도한다라고 얘기를 하고 있습니다. 예를 들면 그러면서 아까 우리 잠깐 얘기했던 조지 허버트에 대해서 얘기했는데, 조지 허버트는 우리가 여러분 아시는 것처럼 크리스천 라이터입니다. 그때 루이스는 크리스천이 아닌 상태에서 이미 예를 들면 그 앞에 있는 조지 버나드 쇼나 이런 사람들의 글이 크리스천이 아니면서도 뭔가 이들의 글이 굉장히 쉽게 말하면 깊이가 없다라는 걸 알게 되고, 오히려 그 조지 허버트의 이 관점이, 그 다음에 특별히 이제 관심 있는 게 뭐니, quality of way, 이 보는 관점, 작품을, 그리고 그 작품에 대해서 세계를 보는 관점이 다르고, 그 다음에 세계를 경험하게 하는 그 관점이 다른 것을 발견하면서 그런 것을 이제 루이스가 어떻게 보면 이제 알게 되고 이제 발견되게 되는 것을 이제 알게 됩니다. 그래서 그 다음에 이제 루이스가 우리에게 도움을 주는 것은 뭐냐면 우리를 이제 인도한다는 거죠. 어떤 면에서 인도하냐면 크리스천 관점이 탁월한 것을 우리를 거기 들어오게 해서 크리스천 관점이 다른 기본의 자기가 무신론자였을 때의 어떤 그 여러 가지 생각들, 그런 것들보다 이미 탁월한 것을 들어와서 보라고 그렇게 이제 얘기할 정도로 그런 면을 좀 보여주고 있다라고 얘기하고 있습니다. 그래서 크리스천 관점으로 인도하고, 그 다음에 어떤 것이 더 나은 거냐, 예를 들면 크리스천 관점이냐 아니면 유물론이냐, 이런 것들에 대해서 구체적으로 제시하고 있는 것을 볼 수 있습니다. 그래서 아까도 말씀드린 것처럼 루이스의 변증의 어떤 태도는 직접적인 하나님의 존재 이런 것들부터 시작보다는 오히려 다른 방법, 그러니까 이제 결국은 이제 나중에 얘기 나올 수 있을지 모르겠지만 결국은 크리스천을 이해하는 어떻게 보면 어떤 그 주변 것들에 대한 그 이해, 예를 들면 일종의 생각의 어떤 생태계, 크리스천 관점으로 볼 수 있는 생태계를 보여준다고 얘기할 수 있겠습니다. 그리고 마지막으로 루이스가 이런 점에서 영 제너레이션, 특별히 에게 굉장히 도움을 준다는 거죠. 특별히 이제 영 제너레이션들은 이제 상상력을 갖고 그런 것들에 대해서 우리가 효과적으로 또 우리 관점에서 볼 땐 전도할 수도 있는 그런 면을 보여준다 얘기합니다. 그래서 루이스가 우리에게 주는 어떤 변증적인 통찰은 상상력을 가지고 우리 기독교에 대한 스토리, 기독교에 대한 그 진리를 잘 설명하고 있다라고 이렇게 말씀드릴 수 있습니다. 자, 우리 세 번째 질문은요. One of the fascinating ideas of Lewis in your lecture is that the mere Christianity allows us to understand Christianity, but the non-historians experienced it. This touches on the importance of imagination, stories, and faith. Could you explain about this further, along with his distinction between the imaginary and the imaginative? And also, please comment on Lewis' idea of imagination in terms of apologetic strategy in the postmodern context right now. Actually, this one is you talks about his effectiveness in postmodern audience in United States. compared to John Stott, right? So, 제가 말씀드린 질문은 교수님 강의 중에 놀라운 아이디어 중에 하나가 바로 순전한 기독교라고 하는 책은 기독교를 이해를 가능케 하고 언더스탠딩이죠. 그 다음에 나니아 책은 그것을 경험케 한다라고 하는 사실입니다. 이것은 여기서 이야기와 신앙에서 상상력의 중요성을 지적하신 것인데요. 이것을 좀 더 부연해 주시겠습니까? 아울러 루이스가 상상이란 개념과 상상력을 구분한 점, 또 포스모던 시대의 변증 전략 관점에서 또 우리 전도 관점에서 루이스의 상상력의 개념에 대해서 말씀해 주시기를 바랍니다.
Well, I think there's some very interesting points here. Let's begin by looking at this point you made towards the end of the question about Lewis and postmodernism. One of the curious things about Lewis is that he's neither modern nor postmodern, and actually that means that people who think in a more modern way, people who think in a more postmodern way, all find something in Lewis. It's very unusual. It's not that Lewis says, well, I'm really modern, but I'm going to pretend to be postmodern for these readers. It's much more his way of engaging the human mind and the human imagination cuts across the division between postmodern and modern. Lewis never gives up on the importance of truth. That's always important. But he also realizes the importance of engaging the emotions, the imagination, being able to use stories to connect with people. And in effect, what Lewis is really inviting us to do is to enrich our vision of the Christian faith. Not to give anything up, but rather to add more things on. And so that I think is a very helpful starting point. And so in many ways what you're raising here, I think, is Lewis and the imagination. And in English, the word imagination is a difficult word because in English there's a very close connection between imagination and imaginary. Imaginary is something you've invented. It doesn't exist. You've invented it because you want it to be true or something like that, but there's no reason to think it is. Lewis is using the word imagined or imaginative to mean something like this. He's saying you have not fully grasped something until you're able to see it in your mind's eye. I mean, for example, supposing you are reading the gospel passion narratives, in other words, the gospel sections dealing with Christ going to the cross and dying. I'm sure that every one of you who reads those stories will form a mental picture of what's happening. And what Lewis is saying is those mental pictures are really helpful and important because in effect the imagination for Lewis is the gateway to the soul. The point he's making is this: if someone finds themselves drawn by the vision of Christianity that you are offering, they are going to say something like this: this sounds very interesting. I don't think it's right, but I want you to show me why it's right, because there's something about this that attracts me. The imagination generates the interest, and then we can begin to show that there's something real that lies behind this. So Lewis will use different methods in Mere Christianity and the Narnia Chronicles. It's the same gospel, but he's presenting it in different ways because people are different. Some prefer reason, some the imagination. Lewis's point: we need them all. That's the key point.
루이스와 특별히 이제 제가 질문한 것 중에서 이제 마지막 부분, 이 포스모던과의 관계는 굉장히 흥미로운 그리고 중요한 내용이라는 거죠. 사실 루이스가 모더니즘이나 포스모던과 관계되지는 않습니다. 실질적으로 그 진영상 저희가 모더니스트도 아니고 포스모더니스트도 아니지만 흥미로운 것은 두 진영과 관련돼서 글을 썼다는 거죠. 두 개, 그러니까 모더니즘의 어떤 지성, 모더니즘의 어떤 truth, 그 다음에 포스모던에서의 어떤 이모션과 상상력을 두 개를 다 글쓰기를 통해서, 작품을 통해서 보여줬다라고 하는 어떤 그 루이스의 어떤 독특성 또는 어떤 탁월성, 독창성을 보여준다라고 하는 것이죠. 그래서 모더니즘에서 보여주는 어떤 truth 개념, 그 다음에 이성의 개념, 그 다음에 포스모던에서 보여주는 어떤 그 imagination, 어떤 emotion, 그런 것들에 대한 것이 이미 루이스 안에서 충만하게 들어가 있다라고 하는 것입니다. 사실 그래서 루이스는 루이스의 이미지를 생각할 때 우리가 이제 이 얘기는 결국 이제 그 imagination and the imaginative 하고 the imaginary를 지금 구분하는 내용인데, 영어에서 imagination이라는 단어는 굉장히 difficult, 좀 어렵다는 것입니다. 왜냐하면 define하기가 왜냐하면 예를 들면 imaginary라고 하는 개념은 쉽게 말 imaginary라고 하는 개념은 상상으로 우리가 번역을 보통 하는데, 사실 이것도 충분하지 않지만 이거는 말 그대로 현실이 있는 것이 아닌 가상의 어떤 내용을 얘기하는 것이죠. 그러나 imaginative라고 하는 이 개념은 어떻게 보면 현실은 분명히 가능성이 있는, 특별히 이제 교수님께서 말씀하신 표현은 뭐냐면 그것을 볼 때까지는 알 수 없는, 그래스프할 수 없는, 포착할 수 없는, 그러나 분명히 있을 수 있는 그런 가능성을 얘기하는 것이, 이게 결국 나중에 이제 결국 나냐 스토리의 어떤 아슬란이나 크라이스트 이런 것들과 계속 연결이 되는 건데, 특별히 예를 들어서 이제 교수님께서 예를 들었던 어떤 가스펠 어떤 스토리에서 얘기할 때 십자가에 대해서 우리가 사실은 이해는 됐지만 그것의 어떤 그 멘털 픽처를 우리가 이해하지 못하면 우리가 그 십자가의 그 어떻게 보면 파워라고 할까? 십자가의 깊이와 높이와 이런 것들을 이해할 수 없다라고 하는 거죠. 그래서 이 imaginative 또는 imagination을 통한 멘털 어떤 그 픽처가 굉장히 중요하다. 그래서 루이스에게서 중요한 것 중에 하나가 뭐냐면 결국은 크리스천리티를 보여준다는 것이죠. 크리스천리티의 어떤 그 충만한 비전을 보여주는 거예요. 보여준다는 거죠. 그래서 효과적으로, 특별히 이제 이미지네이션을 가지고. 그래서 다시 요약하면 이미지너리라고 하는 개념은 실체가 없지만 이미지너티브라고 하는 실체가 있는 그런 것들을 보여주는. 그러나 우리 이제 크리스천 관점에서는 루이스에게 있어서는 지금 이제 다시 앞으로 가면 두 개가 다 중요하다는 거죠. 예를 들면 truth와 imagination, imaginative를 얘기하는 거죠. 그래서 상상력과 어떤 그 진리, 그것을 같이 가야 될 것을 얘기를 하고 있습니다. 그래서 진리와 상상력의 어떤 조화, 균형, 그것이 루이스에게서 굉장히 중요한 거 아닌가라고 하는 것입니다. 자, 이제 네 번째, 시간이 얼마나? 3분 남았어요. 오케이. We have 3 minutes. 오케이. Last one 우리 하죠. Last one. Yeah. Your final point is about the importance of theological legacy of the past, right? And that in other words, Lewis emphasizes the importance of classic to stand against the tyranny of our chronological snobbery or the parochialism, and to find a way to renew the faith of ours. In this regard, could you recommend just two important classics? One is for all the audience, and the other is for the next generation in Korea. 교수님은 마지막 강의에서 신학적인 과거 유산의 중요성을 말씀하셨는데, 다른 말로 루이스는 시대적인 속물근성, 그러니까 무슨 얘기냐면 과거는 무조건 나쁘고 현대는 무조건 좋다라고 하는 그런 속물근성과 편협성의 어떤 폭정에 대항하고 나아가서 우리의 신앙의 갱신을 모색하는 고전의 중요성을 강조했습니다. 이 점에 대해서 교수님께서 두 개의 고전을 추천하신다면 전반적인 우리 성도님들을 위한 거 하나 하고, 그 다음에 우리 차세대 젊은 층들을 위해서 혹시 고전을 하나 추천하시는 어떤 것이 되겠습니까?
Well, thank you for that. I think the Christian journey is like walking with friends, and you talk with them, and you learn from them. And obviously, many of those are alive, but of course, with Christianity, we're learning from the past as well. And so in turning to the past, we're simply saying, here are some writers who've experienced faith and who want to pass their wisdom on to us. So what would I recommend? I think that's difficult because I'm me, you're you, and it's very, very hard for me to make those kind of connections. But what I will say is there are some writers who I find I keep coming back to. I'm going to mention 3 names. You allowed me to. I'm going to give 3 names. Obviously, I'm assuming that Lewis is a name which you'll have gathered I like, so we won't mention Lewis, okay? But I do find that I enjoy reading Martin Luther, that he, in effect, has a powerful theology, a powerful spirituality. And it's very hard to recommend a single work by him. What I will say is, if you can find a book of quotations from Luther, for example, his shorter catechism, which has this wonderful quote, where your heart is or where your security is, that has become your God. That's food for thought. I also continue to find John Calvin deeply satisfying. Again, I do this partly because intellectually he is so interesting, but also because I see here someone who has recognized the importance himself of engaging with earlier writers like Augustine. So I do think Calvin's Institutes, the 1559 edition, certainly the first book of that, will really be very satisfying. But as I get older, I find Augustine of Hippo, a writer who was writing around the time of the collapse of the Roman Empire and reflecting on the place of faith in massive cultural uncertainty. And Augustine's Confessions remains worth reading. Now, you will add many more names to those, I know, but those are ones I think are really helpful. And if they help you as well, I'd be delighted.
His answer is so smart. Not just indicate the books, rather indicate the authors. Okay. 크리스천 관점에서 크리스천들의 어떤 신앙이라고 하는 일종의 여행이라고 얘기할 수 있습니다. 일종의 journey. 그래서 이럴 때 어떤 그 멘토나 과거의 유산이 굉장히 중요한 것을 우리게 됩니다. 그래서 교수님께서는 한 3명, 실적으로 4명이었죠. 4명을 이제 추천하고 싶다고 얘기합니다. 첫 번째가 오늘 우리가 강의를 하고 우리가 지금 이 진행을 하고 있지만 C.S. 루이스가 굉장히 중요하지 않겠냐. 개인적으로는 사실 교수님께서 거의 45 years, he was kind of he considered C.S. Lewis as his sort of lifelong companion, right? Yes. 그래서 먼저 C.S. 루이스를 얘기하셨고, 두 번째가 이제 마틴 루터를 얘기했습니다. 루터의 어떤 강점은 뭐냐면 루터의 어떤 신학의 어떤 그 정밀성과 함께 동시에 그 어떤 영성, 그 다음에 시간이 없다 그러니까 빨리 넘어가겠습니다. 그다음에 존 켈빈, 존 켈빈을 통해서 특별히 이제 존 켈빈의 기독교 강요, 특별히 이제 제일 마지막 1559년판 그 결정판인데 여러분 그거. 그다음에 이제 마지막으로 이제 어거스틴입니다. 어거스틴의 Spiritual Confession, 어거스틴의 어떤 그런 여러 가지 영성과 어떤 지성과 어떤 그 신학의 깊이 여러분들이 그것을 맛본다면 좋지 않겠나. 예, 감사합니다. 다시 한번 큰 박수로 환영하겠습니다. 그러면 우리 지금 시간이요. 지금부터 20분 동안 티타임 시간입니다. 그리고 이때 우리 강사님들은 잠시 교수님하고 해서 이제 지금 사진을 촬영하겠습니다. 그리고 나서 다시 2부 시작하겠습니다. Okay, so let's take a tea break, and the speakers come forward and take us some pictures. 홍 목사님 뭐 하실 말씀 있어요? 오케이, 예.